I have lived in this house for more than 4 decades, and in all those years it has never stopped being more than just a roof over my head or a piece of property with a certain market value, because to me it was always the sum of my life with my wife, the laughter of my children echoing up the staircase, the creak of the floorboards that I laid with my own hands back in the late 70s, when I was still strong enough to carry oak planks on my shoulders without losing my breath, and the smell of fresh paint that I remember from the day we finished the master bedroom, the room that would become ours, my wife's and mine, a sanctuary filled with ordinary but irreplaceable moments, the place where we talked about our future, argued about bills, reconciled in silence, and fell asleep with our hands touching. Now, at 72 years old, widowed for almost a decade, I walk through these same rooms with slower steps, leaning on a cane that feels more like an unwanted extension of myself than a help, and I realize that the house has become both a refuge and a prison, for it holds all the memories of a life I once had, and all the emptiness of what I lost when she died. Every morning I wake up before the sun comes through the blinds, because the older you get, the less your body cares about schedules or comfort, and I shuffle into the kitchen, where I make coffee the way she used to, though no matter how carefully I measure the scoops or how long I let the water sit before pouring it, it never tastes like hers, never carries that soft sweetness she somehow managed to coax out of the same old tin of grounds. I drink it anyway, sitting at the worn table where she once set breakfast for me and our son before school, the same table where she rolled out dough for pies during the holidays, the one piece of furniture I could never replace even when the varnish began to peel and the edges grew dented from years of use. The silence in the morning is heavy, so heavy that sometimes I turn on the radio just to hear a voice, but most days I sit in it and let it press against me, reminding me that I am alone in the place that was supposed to be full. I never imagined that in the winter of my life I would be living with my son and his wife under this roof, not as family who share warmth and respect, but as some kind of tolerated relic, an old man who happens to hold the deed to a property they think of as theirs by inheritance, if not by law. After my wife passed, my son convinced me that it would be easier if he and his wife moved in to keep me company, though I soon realized that company meant oversight, that my solitude was being interpreted as frailty, and that my grief was being measured like weakness. At first I welcomed them, because a house that once felt too small for 4 suddenly felt unbearably large for 1, and I thought perhaps the laughter of a younger couple would bring back echoes of what had been lost. But with each passing month, the laughter sounded less like joy and more like possession, as if they were rehearsing the lines of new owners, while I remained an inconvenient tenant clinging to sentiment. The truth is, I never stopped missing my wife. Her absence is stitched into every corner of this house. The closet in our bedroom still holds her dresses, not because I am too lazy to clear them out, but because taking them away would feel like tearing out a part of the wall, because the smell of lavender that still clings to the fabric is the last remnant of her presence that hasn't faded into memory. Sometimes I open the closet at night, sit on the edge of the bed, and just breathe, convincing myself that she is near, that the years of loneliness since her passing are only a bad dream from which I will soon wake. My son doesn't understand that, or maybe he does and chooses to ignore it, because he sees only clothes, moth-eaten and outdated, and he says things like, "Dad, you should let go, it's not healthy," but he does not know that letting go is the same as erasing, and I am not ready to erase the only person who ever looked at me without judgment. I suppose my story sounds familiar to many men my age who have outlived their wives and now find themselves at the mercy of children who have grown practical, impatient, and cold. The same children who once clung to our hands crossing the street now treat us as fragile burdens as embarrassing reminders of their own aging. My son, who once built forts in the backyard with me, who begged me to read him another chapter even when it was past his bedtime, who cried on my shoulder when he skinned his knee, now looks at me as if I were furniture to be rearranged for his convenience. I tell myself that maybe it is the world we live in now, a world that values speed and independence more than loyalty. But at night, when the house is quiet, and I lie awake staring at the ceiling fan turning above me, I know it is more personal than that. It is betrayal, dressed in the polite words of adulthood. I spend my days in routines that might seem trivial to others, but are lifelines to me. I water the plants in the backyard, even though half of them are dying and the other half grow wild, because my knees no longer let me kneel down long enough to trim them. I sweep the porch, though leaves fall again within hours, because I cannot stand the sight of neglect on the house I worked half my life to maintain. I sit in the living room and read old newspapers, keeping them stacked neatly beside the chair, not because I cannot afford new ones, but because I find comfort in rereading stories already past, as if returning to pages I have already lived spares me the uncertainty of the future. Sometimes I watch the neighborhood children ride their bikes down the street, and I remember when my own son was that small, waving at me from his wobbly seat, shouting, "Look, Dad, no hands!" It is cruel to remember those days now, when the same boy tells me in a steady, almost casual voice that I should move to the smaller room at the end of the hallway, because the master bedroom is wasted on me. There are nights when the house feels like it is whispering against me, when I swear I hear footsteps that are not mine, laughter that belongs to years gone, the echo of my wife's voice calling me to dinner. I know it is my memory playing tricks, but I cling to those tricks because they make me feel less hollow. The irony is that my son and his wife, in their endless rearranging of furniture and their eagerness to repaint walls, do not realize that they are fighting not just against dust and outdated decor, but against the ghosts that hold this house together. They think of modernization, efficiency, resale value, while I think of permanence, of promises made and kept, of a love that filled these rooms with meaning. It is this clash that gnaws at me each day, this widening gulf between the sacred and the practical, between memory and ambition, between father and son. And so, as I sit here writing these words in the same room where I once whispered good night to the woman who carried my heart for 45 years, I realize that I am not merely telling the story of an old man who refuses to move out of his bedroom. I am telling the story of what it means to be displaced in your own life, of how it feels to watch the very people you gave everything to treat your survival as an obstacle. I am telling the story of betrayal wrapped in filial duty, of loneliness sharpened by the presence of those who should provide comfort. My life at this stage is not dramatic in the way of grand events or spectacular misfortunes. It is dramatic in its erosion, in the small daily humiliations that accumulate until they become unbearable, in the quiet recognition that my son no longer sees me as his father, but as a man overstaying his welcome in a house that carries his name. Only on paper, this is where I begin. Because to understand what came next, you must first understand the silence, the rituals, and the ghosts that lived with me in the home I once thought would always be mine. It was an evening like so many others, quiet in the way that houses become quiet when dinner has been eaten, dishes rinsed, and the air settles into that strange limbo between day and night when people retreat into their chosen corners of life. But for me, there was always something heavier about those hours, because I felt most like a guest in my own home then, sitting in my chair by the window, while my son and his wife occupied the living room television with shows I had no interest in, and the sound of canned laughter bleeding into the hallway, reminding me that whatever sense of family I had hoped would return with their presence was, in reality, replaced by something hollow and utilitarian. I was about to retire to my room, the one room where I could still close the door and believe, if only briefly, that I belonged, when my son appeared at the threshold, his voice calm, too calm, the kind of calm that hides calculation. "Dad," he said, standing as though he had rehearsed the posture, his arms crossed loosely, his expression almost sympathetic, but too controlled to be genuine. "We need to make some changes around here. This room, your room, it isn't yours anymore. We're going to turn it into my office. I need a proper workspace. You can move into the guest room down the hall. It's smaller, but it'll be easier for you to manage." I remember the words striking me, not like a sudden blow, but like something sharp dragged slowly across the skin, a deliberate tearing of dignity disguised as practicality. For a moment I thought I had misheard, that perhaps what he meant was temporary, a short-term arrangement while they reorganized. But the look on his face left no doubt that he believed the decision was final, not a proposal, not a request, but an announcement. I stared at him, searching for the boy who once asked permission before borrowing a hammer from my toolbox, the boy who tiptoed into my room at night after a nightmare. But I could not find him. All I saw was a man with plans that did not include me, a man who already thought of my room as his. The silence stretched between us until I finally managed to say, though my voice trembled more with disbelief than anger, "This is my room. I built this house, brick by brick, paycheck by paycheck, every corner of it with my hands and your mother's faith. Your mother's dresses still hang in that closet, our photographs are on that dresser, our life is here. You can't just take it from me." He sighed, and the sigh was the kind people give when they want to end an argument before it begins, impatient and dismissive. "Dad, don't make this harder than it needs to be. You'll be more comfortable in the guest room. It's closer to the bathroom, fewer stairs, more practical for your age. We're just thinking about what's best for you." The cruelty was not in his words alone, but in the way he made them sound reasonable, as though I were the one clinging to something irrational, as though memory and dignity were luxuries I should surrender because the logistics of space demanded it. My hands tightened on the armrests of the chair, and for a moment I wanted to shout, to remind him of the nights I stayed awake fixing the roof during storms, of the double shifts I worked so he could go to college, of the countless times I denied myself comforts so that he could have opportunities, but the words caught in my throat because I realized he would not hear them. His mind was made up, and to him those sacrifices were ancient history, relics of a man he now saw as old, irrelevant, expendable. Later that night, after he and his wife had gone upstairs, I sat in the darkened living room unable to move. The house felt unfamiliar, almost hostile, as though the walls themselves had shifted allegiance. I walked slowly to my room, opened the closet, and touched the sleeve of my wife's favorite dress, the one she wore to our 40th anniversary dinner. The fabric was cold, lifeless, but to me it was still proof that this room was not just space to be repurposed. It was a vault of memory, a place where her laughter still lingered if I listened carefully. The thought of being exiled from it, of being confined to the small, impersonal guest room at the end of the hall, felt like being erased from my own life. The next day my son repeated the statement, more firmly this time, with his wife standing behind him, nodding as if to certify his decision. They spoke of paint colors and new desks, of rearranging furniture, of how it would maximize the use of the house. I listened without answering, because I knew that whatever protest I gave would be met with the same feigned concern, the same suggestion that I was clinging to things that didn't matter. But they mattered to me. Every nail I hammered into these walls mattered. Every conversation I had with my wife beneath this ceiling mattered. Every photograph, every quiet morning with coffee in bed, every argument, every reconciliation. None of it was trivial. That evening, when I lay down beside the shadow of my wife's memory, I felt a dread I had never known before. I realized that I was no longer simply an old man grieving what was lost. I was a man being pushed out of his own history, a man whose son no longer saw him as the rightful keeper of the home, but as an obstacle to expansion, a sentimental relic, occupying square footage. And in that moment, I understood something I had tried to deny, that the battle was no longer about comfort or convenience, but about survival of identity, the right to remain myself in the last place where I still felt whole. After that first conversation, which I tried to believe was some temporary misunderstanding or a poor choice of words on my son's part, the air in the house changed in ways that were subtle at first, so subtle I might have ignored them if not for the way they accumulated, one indignity layered upon another, until the weight of them pressed against me like stones. It began with the rearrangement of furniture in the living room. Pieces that had remained in their place for decades suddenly shifted to accommodate a sleeker, colder aesthetic that belonged more to my son's wife than to the history of the family. She called it opening up the space. But to me it felt like erasing the traces of a life carefully built over years of compromise and effort. The heavy oak coffee table, scratched and marked with the history of our meals and games and projects, was moved into the garage without so much as asking me, replaced by a thin glass surface that looked more like something borrowed from a waiting room than a family home. The framed photographs of my wife and me, our vacations and anniversaries, our son as a child covered in birthday cake frosting, began to disappear from the mantelpiece, replaced by abstract art prints in muted colors. When I asked where the pictures had gone, my daughter-in-law smiled and said, "Don't worry, Dad. I put them in a safe box so they won't get damaged." It was said as if I should be grateful, yet the empty spaces on the walls told a different truth. The story of my family was being methodically boxed up and removed. Meals became another battlefield, though no one called it that. For years after my wife's death, I had maintained my small rituals, preparing simple dinners for myself: soup, roasted chicken, a piece of bread still warm from the oven down the street. But once my son and his wife moved in, my presence in the kitchen was treated as an inconvenience, as though I were trespassing in my own home. At first she offered to cook for me, which I accepted politely, but soon it became clear that what she meant was that I was no longer welcome to prepare anything myself. One evening, when I tried to freeze eggs the way my wife used to make them, she walked in, frowned, and said, "The smell lingers. It's better if you let me handle meals from now on." My son backed her up with a nod, and from then on the refrigerator, filled with food I did not recognize, dishes flavored in ways that made me feel like a visitor at a foreign table. When I attempted to make coffee early in the morning, as I had done for decades, I found the canister of grounds had been moved to a cupboard too high for me to reach. She said she reorganized the shelves for efficiency, but efficiency, I began to realize, was just another word for exclusion. The humiliations grew sharper when visitors came. Neighbors who had known me for years would stop by, and my son would answer the door before I had the chance, ushering them into the living room where he spoke as if the house had always been his. If I tried to contribute to the conversation, he would interrupt, finishing my sentences or correcting minor details with a smile that pretended to be indulgent but carried an edge of impatience. "Dad forgets sometimes," he would say casually, and the neighbor would nod sympathetically, as though I were already drifting into senility. I wanted to protest, to shout that my memory was as clear as theirs, that I remembered every nail I had hammered, every storm I had braced this house against, every milestone in my son's childhood. But the words would lodge in my throat because I understood that the more I insisted on my clarity, the more it would sound like defensiveness, the kind of defensiveness people expect from the elderly when they feel control slipping away. The worst moments were not public, though, but private, small gestures that sliced deeper because of their intimacy. Once, late at night, I came into the living room to find my son going through a drawer where I kept personal letters, cards from my wife, documents that mattered to me. When I asked what he was doing, he looked up calmly and said, "Just organizing, Dad. You've got too much clutter here." I wanted to tell him those letters were not clutter, that every faded word was a lifeline to the woman I had loved, but I saw in his eyes that he had already judged them as relics without value, obstacles to the streamlined house he and his wife imagined. Another time, when I misplaced my reading glasses, his wife remarked almost casually, "It happens more and more these days, doesn't it?" The implication was clear, and though I found the glasses later exactly where I had left them, the sting of her remark lingered longer than the relief of finding them. I noticed also the subtle way my mobility was weaponized against me. The master bedroom, with its broad windows and the closet filled with my wife's clothes, became a contested space. But even before the ultimatum of moving out was repeated, my son began to comment on the stairs, how they might be dangerous for me, how it was better to be closer to the ground floor. He said it with concern, but concern twisted into condescension, as though I were a fragile object waiting to shatter. The irony was that I had carried him up those very stairs countless times when he was a child, asleep in my arms after a long day, and never once did I think of them as dangerous. Now every step I took was treated as proof of my decline, evidence that I should relinquish not only the room, but the authority that came with it. It is hard to explain the feeling of being erased while still alive, of being slowly painted over like old wallpaper beneath a fresh coat. There was no dramatic confrontation yet, no shouting or slammed doors, only the steady erosion of belonging, the sense that the rooms which once echoed with my life were being redefined in a language I no longer spoke. The house began to feel like a museum curated by strangers, with me as the awkward exhibit no one knew what to do with. And though I tried to convince myself that these were small things, that I should be grateful for company in my old age, each small thing cut away at the foundation of who I was, until I realized that the foundation was dangerously thin. The escalation reached its cruelest point one afternoon when, without consulting me, my son and his wife hosted friends in the house. I came home from a short walk and found them gathered in the living room, laughing, glasses of wine in their hands. And when I stepped inside, my daughter-in-law introduced me, not as the man who had built the house, not even as the homeowner, but as our dad who's been staying with us. Staying with us, 3 words that erased 40 years of ownership, 3 words that recast me from father to boarder. Tolerated, but temporary. I smiled weakly, because what else could I do? But when I retreated to my room and closed the door, I pressed my back against it and felt tears rise, not because of the words themselves, but because I understood then that my son had allowed her to say them without correction, without protest, as if he agreed that I no longer belonged. By the time that evening ended and the guests had left, I knew the first battle had been lost, not in a loud explosion, but in the quiet surrender of dignity to silence. They were no longer hiding their intentions. They wanted me diminished, they wanted me out of the way, they wanted my room, my house, my history, and the first escalation, subtle though it may have seemed to an outsider, was already underway. An insidious campaign of erasure disguised as care, of displacement wrapped in the language of practicality. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the laughter of their friends still echoing faintly down the hall, and I realized with a kind of cold certainty that the war for my home had begun, and I was fighting it alone. The moment when everything shifted from quiet humiliations to something darker came one evening when I returned earlier than usual from the small park where I often forced myself to walk for the sake of my knees and a bit of air, because I found that being outside, even among strangers, gave me a kind of protection from the stifling atmosphere that had settled inside my own house. As I pushed open the door and set my cane against the wall, I heard voices coming from the dining room, not raised in anger, but lowered in the confidential tones people use when they are plotting. I paused, not out of a desire to eavesdrop, but because their voices stopped me like a hand on the chest, the way a man pauses at the edge of a cliff when he realizes the ground ahead is not safe. I recognized my son's voice first, calm but edged with irritation, saying, "He won't last much longer, not at this rate, and the sooner we have the paperwork in order, the better. If we wait too long, it'll be harder to convince anyone." His wife answered, her tone smooth, almost rehearsed. "I told you I've already spoken with the attorney. We just need him to sign the power of attorney, and once that's done, everything else follows. People already see him as confused. You've laid that groundwork perfectly. One slip, one incident, and no one will doubt it." I froze, my hand gripping the cane so tightly that the wood bit into my palm. For a long moment I thought, perhaps I was misunderstanding, that maybe they were talking about some relative or a business matter. But then my son continued, his voice growing more confident. "The house will be ours finally, and he'll be safer in a smaller place anyway. A care facility would do him good. They know how to handle memory issues better than we can. It's not cruel. It's practical." At those words, a kind of hollow ringing filled my ears, because I understood with brutal clarity that they were speaking about me, that my son had already begun to speak of me as though I were half gone, a burden to be placed somewhere out of sight, and that every little humiliation of the past weeks had been deliberate, a performance staged to convince others that I was sliding into incapacity. I backed away from the doorway, my heart pounding with the kind of fear I had not felt since childhood, the fear of being cornered, but this time by my own flesh and blood. In the privacy of my room I sat on the bed and felt the walls close in. The betrayal was not only in their plans to strip me of control, but in the coldness of the language, the way my son spoke of me as a problem to be solved rather than a father to be respected. He had adopted the voice of bureaucracy, of efficiency, the language of someone who had already moved past love and into calculation. I thought of all the sacrifices my wife and I had made for him, of the nights we counted pennies to pay for his education, of the way she defended him even when he disappointed us, and I realized those sacrifices had been transmuted into entitlement, a belief that the house and everything I owned were simply delayed inheritance waiting to be claimed. That night I could not sleep. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind outside sounded like the movement of conspirators. I stared at the ceiling and imagined them taking me to some facility, locking me in a room where strangers would feed me bland meals and call me by my first name as though I were a child. The thought of leaving the house, of abandoning the closet that still smelled faintly of my wife's perfume, filled me with such dread that I sat upright, clutching the blanket, swearing silently that I would not allow it. I was not senile, I was not incapable, and I would not surrender my life to their convenience. In the days that followed, their behavior confirmed what I had overheard. My son began leaving pamphlets for senior care centers on the kitchen counter, pretending they were just informational, but placing them where I could not avoid seeing them. His wife made subtle remarks about my supposed forgetfulness, telling me I had left the stove on when I knew I had turned it off, moving my belongings, and then accusing me of misplacing them. It was a campaign, slow and methodical, to create a narrative in which I appeared to be losing myself, and though I tried to maintain composure, to act as though I had not noticed, inside I felt the walls of the house, once my fortress, turning into the bars of a cage, The breaking point came one evening when I sat down at the dinner table and found a stack of papers beside my plate. My son slid them toward me with the same casual authority one might use to hand over a bill. "It's just to make things easier, Dad," he said, his tone warm but his eyes cold. "A power of attorney, nothing complicated. You sign this and we can take care of the finances, the house maintenance, everything, without bothering you. It's what Mom would have wanted, you to be comfortable, without stress." The invocation of my wife's memory in that context was the cruelest cut of all, as though he could conscript her love to justify his betrayal. I pushed the papers back without touching them and said, my voice firmer than I expected, "No, I'm not signing anything." His wife's smile tightened, and I saw in her expression that my refusal was not a setback, but a declaration of war. That night, as I lay in bed listening to the house breathe around me, I realized that I had crossed a line. I was no longer the passive victim of their subtle maneuvers. I was a man who understood the depth of the threat, who had seen behind the curtain of concern to the machinery of greed. And though fear still gripped me, a colder, sharper resolve began to take its place. If they thought I would surrender quietly, they had underestimated not only my memory but my will. This was the midpoint of my struggle, the place where I ceased to hope they would change and began to prepare myself to resist, even if resistance meant severing the last fragile ties that still bound us as family. If the moment I overheard their conversation marked the point at which suspicion hardened into certainty, then what followed in the weeks after was nothing less than a campaign of quiet violence, not with fists or shouted threats, but with the steady, calculated chiseling away of my dignity and authority until they believed I would be too weakened, too humiliated, too confused to resist. The papers I had refused to sign were not the end of the matter, but the beginning of their escalation, and soon I found myself living under the same roof as people who no longer made any effort to hide their contempt, their impatience, their desire to unseat me from the life I had built. The small acts of exclusion that had once been cloaked in politeness became overt. My son's wife began speaking of the house as though it already belonged to them, telling visiting friends how she intended to open up the upstairs space, or how we're thinking of turning the dining room into a study once Dad doesn't need it anymore. They laughed, nodding approvingly, and though I sat only a few feet away, drinking my tea in silence, not one of them seemed to think it odd to speak of my life as though it were already finished, my presence reduced to an inconvenience of timing. Once, when I asked directly what she meant by, "Once Dad doesn't need it," she replied with a smile so thin it could have been a blade, "Well, you might want something easier, smaller, more manageable. We're only trying to plan ahead." But her eyes betrayed her, and in them I saw not concern, but calculation, the cold arithmetic of possession. My son began treating me less as a father and more as a witness whose testimony he was determined to discredit before a trial. He would correct me in front of others, even over details so minor they hardly mattered, insisting that I had gotten a date wrong, that I had forgotten the name of a neighbor, that I had misremembered events from years past. At first I tried to laugh it off, but I soon realized he was doing it systematically, deliberately crafting an image of me as a man whose memory was unreliable, whose mind was slipping. When I objected, he would say with that maddening tone of false patience, "It's okay, Dad. No one expects you to remember everything at your age." And I would feel the blood rising to my face, not because of the words themselves, but because of the condescending way they turned me into a caricature of senility. Worse still were the staged incidents that I began to notice with a growing chill, as though I were living inside some cruel theatre where I was the only one not given a script. One afternoon I came into the kitchen to find the stove burners left on, the faint smell of gas in the air. My son's wife entered behind me, covered her mouth dramatically, and exclaimed, "Dad, did you forget to turn this off again?" This could have been dangerous. I protested that I hadn't cooked anything that day, but she only shook her head sorrowfully, as though humoring me. Later that evening, my son confronted me in the living room, saying, "This is exactly why we need to handle things for you. You don't even realize what you're doing anymore." I wanted to scream that I knew exactly what I was doing, that they had staged the whole thing, but I also knew that in the eyes of others, denial would only make me look guiltier, more confused, more in need of supervision. Then came the matter of the finances. I discovered by accident that my checkbook was missing from my desk drawer, and when I asked about it, my son said casually that he had put it away for safekeeping, as though I were a child not to be trusted with tools. When I demanded it back, he told me that bills had already been paid, that he had handled it. I checked the mail and saw that certain statements, which had always arrived in my name, were no longer coming. When I called the bank, the clerk hesitated before telling me that recent inquiries had been made on my accounts by someone else, inquiries that required my signature but had been accompanied by documents already on file. It dawned on me that they were not only trying to convince others that I was losing my mind, they were also attempting to build the paperwork that would prove it, whether by manipulation or forgery. At the same time, they began inviting people into the house who were not simply friends, but potential witnesses, people to whom they could demonstrate my supposed decline. A lawyer came once, introduced as a friend, and I noticed how my son subtly guided the conversation toward topics meant to trip me up, asking me the date, pressing me to recall when certain repairs had been done, interrupting me to correct my answers with exaggerated gentleness. Later, I overheard him whispering to his wife that he looked a little lost today. That should help if we need affidavits. The sense of being surveilled in my own home, of being cast as an unreliable narrator of my own life, was enough to make me doubt myself in moments of exhaustion, though deep down I knew my mind was intact. The cruelty intensified when they began to isolate me, restricting even the small freedoms I had clung to. If I went for a walk, my son would ask how long I had been gone, as if I were a teenager with a curfew. If I misplaced a newspaper or a book, they would exchange knowing glances that spoke louder than words. Once, when a neighbor invited me over for coffee, my daughter-in-law intercepted the conversation and said, "He's not feeling up to visits these days," as though I were not standing right there, capable of answering for myself. That night, I lay awake realizing that their strategy was not only to strip me of possessions, but to starve me of witnesses, to keep me alone and diminished until their version of events became the only one anyone could hear. The breaking point of this escalation came when they staged what I can only describe as a performance of my incompetence. We had dinner one evening with a couple they knew from his office, and throughout the meal my son and his wife spoke about me as though I were not present. "He forgets to take his medication sometimes," she said, "though I have never once missed a dose. He left the front door unlocked last week," he added, though I knew very well I had locked it, and if it was found open later, it was because they had left it so. When I tried to interject, to defend myself, they shushed me gently, telling me not to get worked up. The couple nodded, their eyes soft with pity, and I realized then that the narrative was working, that to outsiders I already looked like the stubborn old man in denial of his decline. I sat there, chewing food that tasted like ash, and felt the walls close in tighter than ever. In those weeks, my home became unrecognizable. I was a stranger in the house I had built, surrounded by familiar furniture that had been rearranged to serve someone else's vision, trapped in rooms that now seemed hostile to my presence. Every night, when I closed my door, I locked it, not out of paranoia, but because I could not shake the sense that they might enter while I slept, searching for papers, setting up incidents, perhaps even trying to provoke some accident that would serve their purposes. It is a terrible thing to feel unsafe not in the streets or in the company of strangers, but in the presence of your own child, the one you raised with every ounce of strength and love you had. And yet, beneath the fear, another feeling began to grow. Anger, slow and heavy, but unstoppable. They believed they had cornered me, that they could strip me of my dignity and power by increments until I surrendered. But what they had forgotten was that I had lived long enough to see through the masks people wear, that I knew when care was real, and when it was counterfeit, that I could tell the difference between concern and greed. They underestimated the stubbornness that had built this house, the pride that had carried me through years of labor, the love for my wife that still burned like an ember in every corner of these rooms. I realized then that I was not only fighting for myself, but for her memory, for the promise I had made her silently as she lay in her coffin, that I would keep this home, that I would not let her life's work be desecrated by convenience. So while the escalation grew sharper, while their voices grew bolder, while their lies multiplied, I began to prepare. Quietly, secretly, I considered the tools at my disposal, the steps I might take to turn the tide. If they wanted to cast me as a senile old man, I would show them instead the clarity of a man who has nothing left to lose, but everything to defend. I began to move my most important documents into a locked box, one they did not know about. I began keeping a journal, writing down dates, times, incidents, so that no one could say later that I imagined them. And late at night, when the house was finally still, I would sit awake and plan, rehearsing in my mind the moment when the balance would shift, when their cruelty would meet the quiet steel of my resolve. The second escalation had not broken me. It had, in its cruelty, given me the clearest vision I had ever had of what I must do. The night I finally acted began like so many others, with me lying awake in the master bedroom, staring at the faint outline of the ceiling fan spinning above me, listening to the muted creaks of the house as it settled into darkness. I could hear the faint hum of the television upstairs, where my son and his wife had retired for the evening. And I thought again of the voices I had overheard, the staged incidents, the papers slid across the dinner table, all the humiliations that had piled up until I felt like a ghost wandering through the very rooms I had built with my own hands. But that night there was no resignation in me, no fear that held me pinned to the mattress. Instead, there was a sharp, unwavering clarity that told me the time had come, that if I delayed any longer, the house, the memories, the last pieces of my dignity would be stripped from me without even the courtesy of a struggle. I rose quietly, the floorboards groaning softly beneath my feet, and dressed in silence, my hands trembling, not with weakness, but with the thrill of resolve. I had prepared for this moment, gathering the documents that proved ownership, the small lockbox where I had stored my wife's jewelry, and the photographs they had already tried to pack away, the key to the shed where the spare locks had been waiting. For years, remnants of a time when maintenance was a hobby instead of a necessity. I carried them into the hallway, careful not to wake anyone, and with each step I felt my heart pounding harder, not in fear of discovery, but in a rising sense of justice, of righteous defiance against the betrayal that had cornered me for too long. In the silence before dawn, when the world outside was still dark and the neighborhood lay asleep, I moved through the house like a soldier reclaiming territory. I took the locks from their packages, my hands steady now as I unscrewed the old ones, replaced them with new mechanisms, turned the keys until the sound of the bolt sliding into place echoed like a declaration. Door by door I worked, front and back, even the garage, sealing the house not against strangers, but against the very people who had tried to exile me from my own life. By the time I finished, the sky was paling at the edges, the faint light of morning beginning to wash across the street, and I sat for a moment on the porch steps, the cool air filling my lungs, feeling for the first time in years not like a prisoner, but like the master of my home again. When my son tried to leave later that morning, bleary-eyed from sleep, he discovered the first sign of change. I heard the rattle of the doorknob, the pause, the muttered curse as he realized the key he had carried so confidently no longer worked. He called out, his voice sharp with irritation, "Dad, what's going on with the locks?" I stepped into the hallway, the new keys heavy in my pocket, and for the first time in months I looked at him without lowering my gaze. "What's going on?" I said, my voice steady. "Is that this house is mine. These rooms are mine. Your mother and I built this life together, and you will not take it from me with lies and papers and whispered schemes. You will pack your things, and you will leave." He stared at me as though I had struck him, his mouth opening and closing in disbelief, and behind him his wife appeared, her face tight with anger, demanding, "You can't do this, you're not thinking. Clearly you need help." But I only shook my head, pulling from my pocket the deed with my name on it, the proof of ownership that no forged affidavit could erase. "I have never thought more clearly," I said. "This house belongs to me, and if you wish to contest that, you can take it to court. But you will not remain here another day treating me like a guest in my own life." There was shouting then, anger spilling into the walls, threats of lawyers, accusations that I was being manipulated by neighbors or by paranoia. My son demanded to know how I could do this to him after all he had done for me, and I almost laughed at the inversion, at the grotesque rewriting of history, but I kept my composure and simply said, "What you did for me was take what I gave and decide it wasn't enough. What I did for you was everything." He fell silent at that, his anger faltering for the briefest moment as the truth cut through, but his wife recovered quickly, pulling at his arm, hissing that they didn't need to stand here and argue with an older man. They stormed upstairs, and I listened to the frantic rustling of bags, the slamming of drawers, the hurried movements of people who had just realized the ground beneath their feet was no longer theirs. When they finally came down, dragging suitcases behind them, they tried one last time to push past me, to assert the authority they had mistaken for inheritance, but the locked doors met them like a wall. They stood there, faces flushed, keys useless in their hands, and I stepped aside only long enough to open the door myself, holding it wide, a silent gesture that said more than any words could. They crossed the threshold, the morning sun spilling across their faces, and for a moment I saw not the grown man and woman who had tried to undo me, but two strangers, trespassers who had mistaken patience for surrender. Without another word, I closed the door behind them, turning the bolt with finality, and the silence that followed was the sweetest sound I had heard in years. I stood there for a long time, leaning against the wood, my breath coming in shallow gasps, the adrenaline slowly draining from my veins. I expected to feel guilt, perhaps sorrow, but what I felt instead was a deep, steady calm, the kind of peace that comes only when one has faced the abyss and chosen not to fall. I walked slowly back to my room, to the bed where my wife's dresses still hung in the closet, and sat down with the keys in my hand, whispering into the stillness. I kept it safe, my love. I kept our home. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I allowed myself to close my eyes, not in fear of what tomorrow might bring, but in the quiet certainty that I had reclaimed the last piece of myself they had tried to take. When the house finally fell silent after their departure, when the last echo of footsteps faded from the driveway and the rumble of their car dissolved into the distance, I remained standing in the hallway for a long while, unsure of what to do with the sudden emptiness that pressed around me. It was not the emptiness of loss exactly, for I had been living with that since the day my wife died, but a different kind, an emptiness that felt almost clean, like air cleared after a storm. For months I had lived under their shadow, second-guessing every word I spoke, every movement I made, waiting for the next small humiliation to land. But now the house belonged to me again. Every room, every corner, every object returned to its rightful meaning. I walked slowly through the rooms as if reacquainting myself with them, touching the surfaces they had tried to erase, opening drawers where my letters still lay, breathing in the faint scent of my wife's lavender sachets that lingered in the closet. It felt as though she had returned to me, not in body, not even in voice, but in the restoration of peace, in the confirmation that the home we had built together remained intact and protected. Neighbors noticed their absence quickly. Some offered polite questions, others simple nods of acknowledgement, and though I did not go into detail, I let it be known that they had left because the arrangement no longer suited us. I saw in a few eyes the flicker of understanding, perhaps even approval, as though they had suspected what was happening all along. One neighbor, a woman my wife had been close to, squeezed my hand and said quietly, "You did the right thing, even if it was hard." Her words settled into me like balm, because they reminded me that I was not simply an obstinate old man clinging to the past, but a man defending what little remained of his life's dignity. In the days that followed, I set about restoring the house to something resembling its former self. I retrieved the photographs from the boxes where they had been hidden, placing them back on the mantelpiece, each frame a silent act of defiance against the erasure they had attempted. I brought the oak coffee table back from the garage, polishing its scarred surface with slow, careful strokes, each mark a history no glass replacement could match. The rhythms of my days returned, not the same as when my wife was alive, but steady, honest rhythms that belonged to me alone. I made my coffee again in the mornings, strong and imperfect but mine, and I sat at the kitchen table without anyone hovering behind me with corrections or condescension. The silence of the house, once heavy with loneliness, now carried a different quality, one of ownership, of belonging, of earned solitude. I will not lie and say there was no sorrow. To cast one's own son out of the house he once called home is not an act performed lightly, and in quiet moments I still felt the ache of that truth. I looked at photographs of him as a boy, his gap-toothed smile, the way he clung to my hand on his first day of school, and I wondered how that boy had grown into the man who tried to dismantle me piece by piece. Perhaps it was greed, perhaps it was his wife's influence, perhaps it was something broken inside him long before I recognized it. But whatever the reason, he had chosen a path that forced me to choose my own survival over his comfort. I mourned that choice, but I did not regret it. With time, I realized that what I had done was not only an act of protection, but also an act of liberation. I no longer needed to perform the role of the dependent old man they had cast me in, nor endure the indignities they had woven into my daily life. I could live simply, with my books, my plants, the creaking floorboards, and the memory of my wife stitched into every wall. Some might call that loneliness, but to me it was freedom, and freedom, even late in life, is worth any price. Eventually I made a decision that sealed the matter in a way that words never could. I went to a lawyer of my own choosing, a man recommended by an old friend, and I rewrote my will. The house, when my time comes, will not pass to my son or his wife. Instead, it will be donated to a foundation that supports elderly people who have been mistreated or abandoned by their families. The thought of this house, my house, sheltering someone like me, a man or woman pushed aside, told they no longer mattered, fills me with a sense of justice that goes beyond vengeance. It ensures that the walls my wife and I built with love will continue to protect, even when we are both long gone. And so, as I sit here tonight, the keys to the new locks heavy in my pocket. I feel a peace that has been absent for years. I know my son may never forgive me, but forgiveness is a luxury I can no longer afford to seek. What I sought was dignity, and I found it again when I closed the door behind him. My wife's photograph rests on the nightstand beside me, her eyes calm, her smile gentle, and sometimes I whisper to her in the stillness, "I kept my promise. I kept it safe." That is enough. That is more than enough.